In this video, I would like to talk about how new technology, the blockchain, allows us to start to accelerate payment services and loan services. At the moment, banks have two roles. One is they offer loans. They are commercial institutes who offer loans and earn interest on that. So it's a business model for the banks. But at the same time, they also offer the payment services, which means that when you have a bank account, you can use that bank account to move money, a payment, through somebody else. In fact, that means that you are not really moving money, but the banks in between exchange the information about what money is in there and who owns that money. So all banks are linked together all over the world by big networks, like for example SWIFT, which allows the bank to offer that service for their clients. But this means that in fact cash is slowly disappearing because everybody is using the digital services of the bank. But because of that, they have the money in their circuits, in their system. And they have all the information, all the transaction information in there. This was not always the case. In the beginning of last century, there was a separation. We had separate payment services and loan services. The banks with the bank license could offer loans, but at that time we didn't have this big network yet that all banks were connected. So there were separate networks available just for the payments, like, for example, gyro systems, and very often offered by post offices who were offering money transfer services. Only in the last century, 1950s, 1960s, we saw that the payment services and the networks were merging with the banks. But we have to be careful. When we move cash money, when I take my wallet, I take out a note and I give the note to somebody else, I am doing my own transaction. And the other one immediately has that money available. In case of the banks, it is digitized in a central system at the bank. And for that, they use custody accounts. The money is managed by the bank. They use that money as collateral for the loan. It is not, you are not managing that money yourself anymore. It's not your own money. Why did that happen? Well, there were a lot of recessions that started already the end or the middle of the 1900s and 19th century and lasted until 2008. So governments had to start regulating the financial services market because things very often went out of hand. Too many loans not being paid back, the wrong type of loans, not enough money in the economy, inflation was going too high, unemployment was going too high. So governments started to regulate the market. And at the same time, economic theory was getting better and better. People started to understand how economy behaved. So government and central banks worked together to stabilize the economy. But how do they do that? They need information for that. Now, the banks had that information because they act for their clients using the custody accounts, and they have all the transaction information. So in that way, the central banks were able to find out how much money is there in the market, how much inflation is there, how is the production increased, how many investments are making, how much loans are outstanding, all that kind of information, which is being used to find out how the economy operates. But it also means, and that's the other side of the medal, that they started to interfere. So the central banks and the government and the private banks together started to interfere in the payments by manipulating, for example, the interest rate, by manipulating how money is being used in the economy. So by slowly moving away from cash payments, where there is no registration, where you have no information how things are going, you only know how much money you have printed. That's in fact all. We slowly went to a situation where we have a lot of bank systems, centralized systems, collecting all the information, and that information is being used for commercial purposes because banks are commercial institutes, and by the central bank and government for trying to manipulate in the positive way the economy. Now, what happens now? Automation made a change because new technology was introduced for the structure of databases, which is called blockchains. Blockchains are, in fact, comparable to public ledgers. It's a database structure with a supervision built in, and because you use several coins of the same blockchain, we should be exactly equal. You have a structure which protects you against fraud. The second advantage is that everything which is put into the ledger cannot be deleted. Because of that, it's a perfect way of storing transactions, and it gives a lot of transparency regarding transactions, especially when it's being used, for example, for payments. And that was the first application people thought of immediately, because you could store transactions regarding value transactions, which are always related to something, let's call it a token or a coin. We could even introduce stable coins, which were coins which are linked, pegged, it's being called, through a fiat currency like a euro, a dollar, a yuan, in such a way that it's not very volatile. It has quite stable value, but it's being used in the blockchain for the transactions, payment transactions. That's one side, which the introduction of blockchain gave us. Immediately, together with that, people were saying, okay, but then we need wallets. And we need a way of identifying and authorizing people, companies, so that they can say, this is a transaction which is being made by me. And I was authorized to do that transaction. So we always can find out from the transaction backwards that this was a signed transaction by somebody who was authorized. And that we can later on, when necessary, we could find out who made that transaction. This is called a self-sovereign identity wallet. Why self-sovereign? Because the wallet is the tool of the party, the individual or the company, to store the information necessary to show the identity and to show the authority of the party to make transactions without putting that information into the transaction. So there is later on a possibility to trace it back, but only when the person holding the wallet allows the information to be shown. So it's not just that we put the information immediately into a central system. No, we have separate wallets, and the information from the wallet is only given to somebody else when it's being allowed by the holder of the wallet. And it's linked to identity because you always want, in that case, that somebody can identify himself, that the company can identify himself before giving that information or before making a transaction. This will allow you, for the blockchain, to make transactions which are directly between two parties, because you can identify both parties, you can authenticate both parties, which means that you can exchange the information necessary for the transaction and store it in the blockchain. You don't need an intermediary. You don't need a bank anymore. The blockchain gives the network infrastructure by itself, globally. The only add-on you need for that are contracts. In the case of the blockchain, that's called smart contracts. Why? Because they are programmable contracts. In fact, what happens is that when a transaction is being built, the conditions for that transaction are determined by both parties and written down as programmable text, which means that the contract is just, in fact, a program which will be executed when the transaction is taking place. So the blockchain is giving us three new ways. One is a public ledger, not a central system, but fully decentralized globally. It allows us to make transactions using value, using digital representations in the form of token, coins, or stablecoins. And those transactions are being named by parties who are using wallets and contracts, programmable contracts, for the execution of the transaction. Now, what's the advantage? The advantage is that we don't need an intermediary anymore. We don't need the whole network of the banks. For the banks, that's a disadvantage because the money is not flowing through them, which means they cannot use the money as collateral. But on the other hand, for economic growth, etc., the lower the cost for payments, the better it is for everybody. And secondly, the information is split in personal information and transaction information. The personal information is not in the central system anymore. It's not in the system of the intermediary. So we get cash-like transactions between parties using SSI wallets. And there is no commercial use of transaction information anymore at the bank. That's a huge advantage seen from the point of the client. Thank you for your attention. I will continue to publish more of these short introductions with some background information about what is happening at the moment in the financial services market related to personal information, privacy, and cybercriminality.